With only 148 Americans officially killed in action and only 467 wounded, ours seemed to be a shining victory in the Gulf. But this victory has lost its glow somewhat now that we know that tens of thousands of our Gulf service people have become sick from a mysterious, debilitating, and sometimes deadly syndrome. The Department of Veterans Affairs has reported that approximately 6,000 soldiers have died since the war's conclusion, including 1,300 18 to 24-year-olds who were in perfect health prior to the war, but who mysteriously contracted various forms of cancer after their involvement with the military.
This war was a different war. It wasn't the war of gun shells, of bullets, exploding mines. This was a new technology.
It's like they use sophisticated weapons on us, and we're suffering from some type of sophisticated illness, but there's no sophisticated protocol or treatment program for us.
My doctor says we brought something back from the Gulf, and it's unexplainable.
This one, unlike Agent Orange, is not going to die when the veteran dies. This one is contagious. This one is a biological, and it is loose.
My greatest fear is that the human race has been experimented on, and that it will continue.
Doctors and researchers say they have found significant brain damage, immune system problems, autoimmune diseases. We found early on that the veterans were showing viruses, and not just one virus like a cytomegalovirus in their body, but multiples.
But I look at it sometimes that he probably would have been better off getting killed over there. It's an awful thing to say, than coming home and watching him suffer the way he's suffering now.
There's been a recent cascade of revelations about our Gulf War experience, and today, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist, simply a reader of mainstream media to understand that our government has been trying to hide important facts from us for most of this decade.
It's a great day to be a soldier, and it's a great day to be an American.
You trusted the people that gave the orders, and I guess they trusted the people that gave them the orders.
We should have learned something from our Vietnam experience with the Agent Orange, but it appears that we really have not. Our veterans are having to go through the same process that our Vietnam veterans did, and that's just totally unacceptable.
It's harder fighting the VA, and it's definitely harder fighting the Pentagon than it was the Iraqis.
They're afraid to come forward now. These guys are not afraid of machine guns and bombs and sandstorms, but they're afraid of their own government.
In the last 6 years, I've interviewed hundreds of Gulf War veterans, medical doctors, scientists, legislators. Many of these people are concerned that they don't want to live the same legacy as what happened during and after the Vietnam War, waiting 20 years before a reluctant government, Defense Department, Pentagon, would do anything to compensate for the illnesses that GIs claimed had been caused by the defoliant 2,4,5-T Agent Orange. Now, more than 100,000 of the service personnel that served in the Gulf are claiming that they are suffering from Gulf War syndrome. What is it that the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the Veterans Administration fears by being open, candid, coming forward and laying all the facts before the American public? Were these veterans exposed to experimental vaccines? What was the effect of depleted uranium? How about the anthrax and botulism inoculations given to them? These are some of the questions that we're going to look for answers. I'm Gary Null. Join me now for an in-depth look at Gulf War syndrome, a deadly legacy. one cause of Gulf War syndrome. Instead, we are dealing with a multiplicity of poisons. As is the case with most health issues, Gulf War syndrome is a complex problem. Servicemen have been plagued with a broad spectrum of chronic disorders. A variety of hazardous substances they encountered in the Gulf, including poison gases, diesel fumes, petroleum-related pollution, parasites, experimental medications, and biological warfare agents, are all part of the syndrome. Two ex-CIA employees asserted that the CIA had evidence of up to 60 Gulf War incidents of American troops' exposure to chemical weapons. Tens of thousands of our people in the Gulf may have been exposed, said Patrick Eddington, who had specialized before resigning from the CIA in analyzing aerial photographs of that region.
Well, the intelligence community assessment before the war was that Iraq had actually moved the weapons into the theater of operations. The chemical weapons, for certain, had been moved into the theater of operations. Now, how did we know that? Well, we had human spies that were basically passing that kind of information. But we also saw evidence on the ground of the Iraqis constructing chemical decontamination trenches outside of ammunition depots. Well, you don't need to do that unless you've got chemical weapons there, because there's no need to have a chemical decontamination trench unless chemical agents are present. So that was one of the major indicators that we had that the weapons were actually forward deployed. We knew that Saddam had various nerve and blister agents in his chemical arsenal, things like sarin, soman, and tabin for nerve agents, and mustard agent and possibly lewisite for the blister agents. But we also knew that Saddam had a very active biological warfare program, and that was also a great concern, things like anthrax, botulinum toxoid. And the problem with dealing with the biological issue is that there are very few indicators, reliable indicators, that it's actually being used. It's the kind of thing that can be employed by special forces operating behind the lines. An aircraft with a spray tank can dispense it. A lot of different ways that you can actually get that kind of agent on the battlefield. So we knew the threat was real. There was clear evidence that it had been forward deployed. And that's why when General Schwarzkopf and others were claiming after the war that they had never found anything, that it really didn't make sense to a lot of people.
I mean, they knew what they were getting into. They knew what they sent over there. I mean, it's not just like it, happened. Now they're coming up and saying, oh, we didn't receive those papers while we were there. We didn't know nothing about it. Come on. You go over to fight a country or whatever, and you don't know what you're doing? Then we shouldn't have gone.
A sad irony of the Gulf War involves the origin of Iraqis' biological weapons. At least some of them came from the United States. According to the Regal Report, during the 1980s, the United States government supplied Iraq and its Atomic Energy Commission with at least 28 biological weapons to use in its bitter war with neighboring Iran. In 1987, then Vice President George Bush met with Iraqi officials to ensure that technological equipment used to produce chemical and biological warfare agents would continue to be exported to the Iraqis. When he assumed the presidency, Bush maintained this policy despite congressional dissension. Corporations involved in transactions with the Iraqi government included Hewlett-Packard, Honeywell, Rockwell, and Tektronix, were licensed to export more than $1.5 million of highly sophisticated equipment in the 5 years preceding the Gulf War. The facts get even more astounding. Recent evidence has revealed that the United States companies continued to export shipments of highly sophisticated weapons to Iraq up until 2 weeks prior to the invasion of Kuwait. Additional evidence suggests that scientists at the University of Baghdad were working in conjunction with American-trained experts to develop mutated forms of mycoplasma that could be used in biological warfare.
Well, there is absolutely no doubt that the United States government aided and abetted Saddam Hussein's chemical and biological warfare programs. We know that the Commerce Department issued licenses to various American companies to ship dual-use chemical or biological components to Iraq during the 1980s. And one of the biggest scandals, I think, in all of this is that one of the entities that was shipping pathogens, biological pathogens, to Iraq was the Centers for Disease Control. Now, that's absolutely astonishing that a U.S. government agency is going to turn around and ship this kind of material to a dictator who we know has an active biological weapons program. The entire non-proliferation regime that we have in place completely fell apart. It was completely ignored, and it was ignored for political reasons. Because Saddam Hussein was our friend in the 1980s. He was killing Iranians for us. He was keeping our oil lanes in the Persian Gulf open, essentially. So it was okay for Saddam to get a wide variety of support from the United States, during that period of time. But in doing that, we created essentially our own Frankenstein in the Persian Gulf. That's really what it boils down to.
According to UN officials, Iraq possessed at least 50 bombs loaded with anthrax, 100 bombs containing botulism, and 25 missile warheads carrying other germ agents. Secret Iraqi biological warfare programs were also responsible for the production of at least 78 gallons of gangrene-inducing chemicals that were capable of penetrating the body and infecting wounds. Other agents included yellow rain, a lethal fungi responsible for bleeding gums, and a deadly toxin derived from castor oil plants called ricin.
The same types of agents were deployed by the Iraqi army against the Iranians as were deployed by the Iraqi army against the Americans. We believe this to be the case. Studies will have to be done in the future, but at least we're getting a whole lot of cooperation from the Iranians, whereas we're getting nothing but BS from our own government on this matter.
This photograph shows several American munitions that have chemical markings on them that were captured from Iraqis during Operation Desert Storm. Questions that burn in every Gulf War veteran's mind is, how did they get these rounds? These are American-made rounds. Who supplied them to them? What channels did they go through? Were these the rounds that were possibly used against the very own American forces who went over there to serve and protect?
The first time we got bombed was the first day of the war in Dhahran. And we were all scared, and so the rumor went around that they bombed those Scud missiles, so we won't ever have any more chemicals or biologicals, even if that one might have been positive. And so I assured my troops, don't worry about a thing, those are just, nothing. But with the symptoms we would be having, during the bombing, when the Patriots would smash into the Scuds, that was bad enough, but it would be like after, when the dust would start to settle from whatever was in those Scuds. I think that's what caused a lot of our problems. Dizziness, and maybe that's why I fell down so much, and others too, And so we would have symptoms afterwards, like rashes. Many of us got rashes. And each time, well, you're allergic to the charcoal that's in your mop suit, Or there was always a plausible reason that was given to us. And I think many of us tried to keep from complaining too much so that we wouldn't frighten our troops.
Reserve units observed warheads that exploded, dispersing a purplish blue vapor. During this time, chemical alarms sounded. People exposed to these vapors subsequently became very sick, and many have died.
During Operation Desert Shield and Storm, from approximately January 16th on, there were over 14,000 chemical alarms that were reported into CENTCOM, Central Command under General Schwarzkopf, and Army Central Command. Every last one of those over 14,000 chemical alarms was dubbed by the Department of Defense as being a false alarm. However, DoD, using the M8 alarm, which is what we had used during that time, stated that they are not only not going to take that alarm out of service, they are now purchasing a brand new version, a standoff capability alarm, from the exact same people that manufactured the M8 alarm, of which 14,000 supposedly were faulty.
It's clearly documented that chemical alarms went off constantly And the incidents such as Al Jubail, for example, the troops were told that they'd heard a sonic boom. And many of those troops are very ill, and it's not really explainable through chemicals. So I suspect that could have been a biological attack.
I was on the telephone with my son on the 19th of January 1991. Talking to him, there was another young man that was on the telephone to his mother, a young man by the name of Michael Adcock. And as Mrs. Adcock, Hester, and I were talking to our sons, we heard the explosion via the telephone. This is the explosion that the Pentagon claims was a sonic boom. The following day, there was a Scud pulled out of the port and put up on shore. My concern with this issue is the fact that Michael Adcock died 11 months after he returned from the Persian Gulf. These two young men, my son and Hester's son, were within 30 feet of each other. We have no idea what caused Michael to die or how he got the different cancers that he got. But we know that it was an explosion. It was not a sonic boom.
One of the jobs I was given one day was asked to take my native divers and dive upon a Scud missile that had just dropped down into the port. I refused to put my divers on site because of the fish that I saw floating around in the bay. I studied marine biology in the University of California and decided that it wasn't from percussion that these fish were dying from, nor was it from the fuel that was in the rocket. I had determined that I felt it was a chemical agent, and therefore I chose not to endanger my Filipino divers to recover the missile. I know that professional divers with special diving equipment came in 2 days later, recovered the missile at night, came back to me and asked me to load this cargo container onto a truck that was to go to Dhahran and be transported back to the United States.
Iraqis were operating under a Soviet war doctrine that suggests mixing together chemical and biological agents. One CIA report indicates that 40 or more of these Scuds were exploded with both chemical and biological weapons.
We smelled that very strong odor. We smelled all of the ears, the ears started to hurt, the eyes started to water, the throat burn, everything. Everybody just kind of went like this all of a sudden. We were told to put on our gas masks, and nobody really told us why. But the chemical alarms never went off.
We do have military documentation to support assertions of biological and chemical weapons in the Gulf. For instance, battlefield reports of the 513th Military Intelligence Brigade confirmed the release of anthrax on February 24, 1991, at King Khalid Military City, while documentation from the following day reveals the presence of lewisite, a nerve gas that could have been released either by an Iraqi assault or a result of secondary explosions.
In 1995, the Department of Defense released on its internet site GulfLink loads of documentation that had been kept secret up until that point. Pressure from veterans groups, from the President's Advisory Committee, from many different resources had pressured them into releasing this documentation. It was not a good faith move on their part. They may state that it was, but it wasn't. They were forced into this. They had no other recourse. When they released this documentation, I and others downloaded the information and started pouring through it to find something, some sort of answers. One of the answers that I found were a thing called grid coordinates, which basically is the north, south, east, and west demarcations and points that you can mark off on a map to find something. The points that they put out in their documentation were areas of the chemical and biological production facilities and storage facilities that they bombed, as well as potential exposure hazards and downwind hazards. They marked them very specifically and extremely accurately. This would show, in my own coinage, exposures at a glance. It's a graphic representation, a real no-brainer to show the proximity of the troops to the storage and production facilities that were bombed. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that downwind hazards existed in profusion and would have presented such an overwhelming downwind hazard that DoD should have known better than to initiate such an action. This map is the one that I put together. The points on here are clearly marked and color-coded. There's 59 separate points on here. This shows in white the troop emplacements in Saudi Arabia prior to the actual war, the ground war. The blue is where we moved into Iraq after the ground war was initiated. The green is the biological production and storage facilities that we bombed. The yellow is the chemical production and storage facilities we bombed during the coalition air campaign. The pink one in the middle is the Qamishiyya bunker, bunker number 73 in the Qamishiyya complex. The red is a very interesting problem for the Department of Defense. These 12 red dots show where Saddam Hussein attacked his own people from the 2nd to the 26th of March 1991 using chemical agents and deploying those chemical agents from the helicopters that we foolishly let him keep. We allowed him to kill his own people, and considering that our people were within eyesight distance of these cities and were able to watch these helicopters fly over and spray these people, that was a downwind hazard. These agents were released high in the air in whole content, no burning or anything like that. It was a downwind hazard that our troops were exposed to directly. The Department of Defense also noted in one of their own documents that the Joint Interrogation Facility at Hafr al-Batin and the 410th Evac Hospital in the same area received casualties from these cities without warning the individuals that were going to be treating these people that they could potentially be contaminated with chemical agents. They were brought in by buses from the front lines up in Iraq. They were taken to these facilities. The DoD investigators looked these people over, verified where the attacks had occurred, wrote down the grid coordinates, type of agent that was used, amount of people that were killed, every last bit of detail, but did absolutely nothing to warn these people that they were being cross-contaminated by these Iraqis.
Senator Regal's 2-year study disclosed information pertaining to the 12 biological, 18 chemical, and 4 nuclear facilities within Iraq that were destroyed by coalition forces. After the attacks, atmospheric currents transported malignant airborne debris to the vicinity of Allied troops. This is documented in U.S. satellite photos.
The question that poses on my mind is this. You are watching a film of a bunker getting blown in which a ring actually forms at the top of the bunker into a solid mass, separates from the smoke, and hovers in place as a solid for about 5 minutes. This plume that is very distinct in the picture has been described unofficially to me through various sources that this was in fact chemical munitions going off. I don't think a conventional bunker would do that.
We had contaminated everybody in theater to some extent or another. The reasoning behind that is the dust that was surrounding the facilities that we bombed during the coalition air campaign was of a type, size, and composition that's perfect to manufacture a thing called dusty agents. All you'd have to do is literally bring the chemical agent into contact physically with the dust that's in the area naturally existing, and the dust would allow the chemical to go into the crenellations, into it, and carry it on the wind. Sarin, a nerve agent, which normally would last in a desert environment for 30 minutes to maybe an hour at the most in its natural form, when it's adhered to this dust, would last a few weeks. Its persistency would be so increased that it would be able to travel on the wind all the way down to Saudi Arabia. It would contaminate the troops downwind. Any modeling that the Department of Defense and CIA has done to date did not include that vital factor.
We've had a couple chemical alarm scares where we've had to put on our mask and our full chemical suit, and they all happen to be false alarms. There's little trace chemical in the air, but we think it's because the plants have been blown up in Iraq and the air is filtering this way. They say it's not enough to hurt you though.
DOD knew all the way back to 1988 with this report that dusty agents would penetrate our chemical suits in such profusion under such low wind conditions as to make our chemical suits totally and utterly useless. They still deployed us with this equipment. That, to me, is criminal negligence. This shows a window of vulnerability to our chemical suits. This window of vulnerability in size, composition, and type matches exactly the type of dust that Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait contains naturally, which means when we blew up those facilities, anybody that would have been in the path of a downwind lethal concentration would not have survived even in a brand new out-of-the-package chemical suit.
Now, when you think about the amount of money that the Reagan administration poured into the Pentagon in the 1980s, you would think that we would have gas masks that work, but we don't. And that's a big vulnerability.
March 3rd, 1991, the Army Central Command, 7th Corps, and Central Command itself, under General Schwarzkopf, were all notified that POC David Allen Fisher had become a chemical agent, blister agent casualty. They examined him thoroughly. They did urinalysis, they did skin tests, they did everything that they were supposed to do to verify that this person had come in contact with a chemical agent. They stated as much in their documentation. The statement by General Schwarzkopf on the 3rd of March 1991, upon being told that this had occurred, essentially said, okay, if anybody asks, we'll admit to it that it did happen, but we're going to try and downplay it in the media, and we're going to not make a big deal out of this. What should have occurred at that time was a full-blown message going to every individual going near a bunker should have been informed. We have a hot zone capability here. We need to protect our troops first. That should have been the first priority because it's after the entire war is over. It's a ceasefire action. No casualties should have occurred during that time frame. This is absolutely inexcusable. This is what I consider they dropped the ball. Schwarzkopf, all the people that were over there, they had total and complete knowledge that this was going on, yet they let it happen. Even after Fisher had gone into the bunker, they still could have protected other people. The 3rd of March was when Schwarzkopf and Franks was notified that this bunker in Iraq had chemical agents in it and there was a blister casualty from it. The 4th of March, the day after this was gone through the system, was when Kamasia, the bunkers, was blown up. That should never have occurred. They should have stopped all demolitions. They should have sent NBC teams in to do sampling. They should have made an overt effort to protect the troops. They didn't. They have lied ever since, and they have kept all that information secret. This information is now coming forward, and they're going to have to answer for it. I want some answers. The veterans deserve some answers. The spouses that these people brought this stuff home to need and should be able to demand answers from these people, and something should be done about it.
Was the demolition carried out recklessly? Pentagon officials have asserted that the obliteration of the Iraqi bunker was supervised by experts trained in chemical warfare. But according to several U.S. service personnel who were present at the scene, this was not the case. According to Corporals Brian Martin and Chris Tullius, whose recollections of the detonation have been corroborated by their executive officer, Major Randy Riggins, chemical specialists were never present and testing that was supposedly conducted prior to and after the demolition of the bunker did not occur. Martin, who had videotaped the entire proceeding at the bunker, revealed that chemical detection devices were not even taken out at the site, while Riggins indicated that his troops did not examine the inside of the bunkers because the entrances had been mined by the recently departed Iraqis. According to Riggins, the enormous explosion of the detonation caused a downpour of debris to fall upon himself and his troops. Riggins recalled that the immensity of the blast had triggered chemical detector alarms at engineer camps 10 miles away. Unfortunately, the servicemen present at the depot were not provided with ample warning, and consequently their exposure to toxic fallout has since resulted in numerous reports of chronic disorders within the unit.
The DoD didn't acknowledge to us that our troops were exposed to chemicals. The CIA basically covered up this fact from us, our committee, for a long period of time. And it was only when we had a soldier who had come in and had actually a video of our troops blowing up a depot, Camisea, and showing the films of the shells, the rockets, the chemical notation on some of the weapons. It was only then that at 4 o'clock on a Friday before our Tuesday hearing that the DoD hastily called a press conference to acknowledge that maybe approximately 900 of our troops were exposed. Then they increased it to over 1,000, then 5,000, and then around 10,000, then around 20,000. It kept growing and growing. And then we learned that maybe some of the biological and chemical plants that we blew up, that the plumes from those explosions went towards our troops, not away from our troops. And now they're acknowledging that it was low level, but possibly our 100,000 plus of our troops were exposed to that kind of exposure.
Where the cloud from Camisea went, I don't know. And I think all the best models in the world can't say for sure. I know that the chemical alarms went off on numerous occasions, and after a while, we had just been told so many times to take off our masks, we never even bothered to put them on.
You have the rather less sensitive equipment that our soldiers would carry with them into the theater, and then that would trigger off a concern, and then you'd bring in the Fox equipment, which is really specialized equipment where our soldiers don't even get out of the equipment. They can go in these vehicles and they can test for all different types of exposure. And we had testimony from one soldier who said, I was trained in this. This wasn't a casual training that I received. This was my business. And under oath saying our troops were exposed. And then having others say, well, no, the soldier is mistaken. Well, I believe our soldier.
One of the more serious allegations concerning Gulf War syndrome is the use of unapproved, untested vaccines. The widespread use of experimental vaccines during Desert Storm has often been cited as a possible cause of Gulf War syndrome. Often agents that we think innocuous turn out to be harmful. The established procedures of vaccination were ignored. Normally, only one inoculation should be given at a time, but the military insisted on giving multiple shots at once, which, according to Dr. Garth Nicholson, an expert in the area, is the worst thing you can do because it suppresses the immune system.
A vast array of vaccines were administered to the troops. It would be impossible, without having a list here with me, to read you even those specific ones that the government admits to having administered. But they run the gamut everywhere from pertussis, whooping cough. Can't imagine why we would think that Saddam Hussein would infect our troops with whooping cough, all the way through to plague and many, many other things in between. This is not to say that some of the vaccines that were administered would not be necessary to the likes of you and I if we were traveling under normal circumstances to certain parts of the world. But again, we come back to the question of the excessive number of vaccines that were administered in a very short period of time, and administered rather indiscriminately, it would appear, to given groupings with no rhyme or reason for it.
I feel the immune and neurological damage that I was exposed to includes chemicals, vaccines, being that we had a multitude of vaccines, and a vaccine that I still have not gotten an answer of what it is, the ISG shot, which was not the same as IgG shots.
Many doctors that I've talked to are convinced that there was something wrong about the vaccinations and that it may be connected to the NIH Manhattan Project. Some of them have told me that they have noticed that the gamma globulin shots are not listed on Gulf Link as having been given, and yet $1.5 million was spent on them, and the number to be vaccinated was 260,000.
I was alerted for the war August 3rd, and we started receiving vaccines then, gamma globulin shots, yellow fever, typhoid, everything that they usually give you to go overseas. During the war, though, I received anthrax and botulinum, and then pyridostigmine bromide, which was 330 milligram tablets a day.
When you start to get into the story of the Gulf War illnesses, you learn that a lot of things weren't done properly. Troops taking drugs, taking vaccines that were experimental. They didn't know they were experimental. They should have been told. When the FDA gave approval for experimental drugs to be used, they anticipated and had every right to expect that, one, our troops would be informed, and secondly, that there would be proper record keeping. That wasn't done. So the FDA has a role in this process too, because they haven't properly followed up.
I know that we were exposed to a lot of different things. In Kuwait, it was the oil wells. We had 60 oil wells burning next to our tents, and there was never any darkness. I know that they sprayed insecticides and in many different environmental hazards.
And I saw a lot of Marines coming down so covered with oil and so covered with oil smoke, having not seen any sunshine for I don't know how many days, coughing and retching, and so covered it was kind of like one of those wildlife rescues. We couldn't let them light up for a cigarette because we were afraid they'd burn themselves. Even at that time in 1991, we sat outside of our casualty receiving and we said, if this is what's happening on the outside, if this is what they look like on the outside, what must they look like on the inside? What must their lungs look like from breathing this? Because those gas masks, they don't work against things like that. The particles, they don't, and you can't keep them on, it's too hot. You couldn't tell who was white and who was black until they got in a shower. That's how grimy these poor people were.
My husband was with the 143rd MP Company out of Hartford, Connecticut, and they went over to Saudi in January of '91 to guard the POWs. That was their job. They were in the POW camps. He came home in May of '91. Now, while they were there, I know he was given umpteen vaccines. He doesn't know what they were. There were many Scud missile attacks. There was talk, I don't have any proof of it, of Saddam Hussein using chemical warfare against his own POWs because he didn't want them to talk. They were spraying the POWs with lindane, which is a known cancer-causing agent. Now, they were doing this in an enclosed tent with no protection at all in powdered form in pressurized cans on 12-hour shifts. So they were breathing this, absorbing it through the skin. And I understand now the U.S. Army no longer uses that substance.
There is an aspect of our participation in the Gulf that has not received much publicity, but should. Our use of depleted uranium in the Gulf. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process. Its name implies that this is a harmless material, but in actuality it is still highly poisonous, radioactive, and heavy metal. U.S. and British forces used Operation Desert Storm as a testing ground for the widespread employment of depleted uranium. It is estimated that over 940,000 30mm uranium-tipped bullets, 14,000 large-caliber depleted rounds were used. Between 350 and 800 tons of depleted uranium residue, with a half-life of 4 billion years, permeate the ground and water in Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia.
I was exposed to unspent uranium that was on the armament that I loaded aboard the ships.
How far the sand-sized particles of that spread and inhaling, ingesting it, no one knows.
More and more findings are being acknowledged about the Gulf War syndrome picture, and one of the most important is that our troops were exposed not just to a single toxin, but to a whole variety. So we can't lose sight of the power of synergy. That is, when two or more relatively weak illness-causing factors combine, they can cause precisely the syndrome we call Gulf War syndrome. These symptoms appear to be a type of organophosphate poisoning, report the researchers. What's more, they note that the subtle nerve damage caused by organophosphate poisoning can be missed by physicians unfamiliar with the phenomena.
Shortly after the Persian Gulf War, within 6 months, the veterans came back and started to complain of various illnesses. In the summer of 1993, I was asked by then U.S. Senator Donald Regal to conduct an investigation into the adequacy of health care at the VA hospitals for the Gulf War veterans. And within several days, we came up with a great deal of evidence to indicate that the veterans were exposed to a number of compounds, including possibly low levels of chemical warfare agents that might be contributing to the illnesses that they're suffering.
When we look at the troops overall, some individuals apparently are not sick, some are minimally ill, others are chronically ill, and of course an increasing number are dead. The more time that passes without an appropriate solution to this problem, the more people will lose their lives. I think confusion has been created, perhaps with the public at large and with certain segments of the government, due to the massive number of symptoms that the sick troops present with. Nothing really seems to tie into one specific disease, and therefore Gulf War syndrome is a convenient label that has been attached to this for the moment.
We've found if you do SPECT scans, that almost every vet that has a brain SPECT scan will show brain damage. We've shown that there is a developing problem with vision, which could be connected with the cytomegalovirus upload in our system and that coming out. It's very clear to me in talking to my civilian peer group that we have significant problems that are only going to get worse without appropriate testing and treatment.
You have perhaps 200 to 250,000 that we know are currently sick. You have the death toll standing at, is our best guesstimates, of 10 to 15,000 at this point, not counting spouses, etc. And yet, we cannot get a national epidemic investigation going when the numbers look like potentially 3 million Americans are potentially exposed to this illness.
The cartilage in our joints, many of us, not just me, seems to be disintegrating. So there must be some reason besides time and wearing out factor. I have my right wrist is fused, my left wrist is partially fused, my right knee has just been replaced 5 months ago, my right hip has been replaced a year ago, my left hip's got to be replaced, my left knee, you name it. My hip joints are all, I wake up in the morning, I have such terrible pain in my joints. And all they tell me is just take pain medicine. that you're going to have your joints replaced. So I don't think that's the answer, you know. And why didn't they do something for us before now, before we get falling apart? And like I was saying before, I may be older than most of them, but I'm not the only one complaining about these very same things. I have a 26-year-old friend that they're refusing to do anything for, who has the same problems I have. You know, so there's got to be something to this business of what they bombed us with. I don't think it was just chemicals. I'm very convinced it was biologicals too.
First realized that there was something wrong with my son in January of 1992, when we found him on the floor in his bedroom with the lights out, banging his head against the floor, suffering from headaches. As we worked with that program, we noticed other symptoms. He was suffering from sensitivity. His eyes were hurt with bright lights. He had loose teeth. He had hair falling out. He had rashes. He had water blisters. He had mood swings. He had weight swings. He had toenails falling out. He had things like aching joints, sleeplessness. All of the issues that have since come to be known as Gulf War syndrome.
I have what is considered a demyelinating disease. The myelin in my brain was unraveling. A civilian doctor has diagnosed me with untreated epilepsy, and but the Army is going with unexplained neurological damage.
If I wear diapers, because I don't know when I'm going to have a bowel movement. I have no rectal muscles, no bladder muscles, no sphincter muscles left. And then the easiest way for me to remember is I have memory impairment. I was diagnosed with toxic encephalopathy of the brain, decreased blood supply to the left thalamus of the brain. I have central and peripheral vision disorders. I can't see beyond this. I've developed hypothyroidism, and they said all I have left is some thyroid strands now. And I could probably show you this. I developed skin rashes that before they were just rashes, but now they've turned out to be, they break open and they blister and I bleed. And I have scarring from here on down from this type of rash that developed. This has been going on since 1993, but before they were just little papules, but now they turn into blisters. Then I have a suppressed autoimmune system. I was diagnosed with antibody development, chemical toxicity, and neurological problems.
According to Dr. Garth and Nancy Nicholson, the chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome, characteristic of sick Gulf vets, is induced by an unusual microorganism that seems to be the product of weaponization, that is, human manipulation of germs for the purposes of warfare. The Nicholsons report that the organism present in each of the Gulf War syndrome patients is an odd variant of a typical mycoplasma.
Dr. Nicholson has observed 50% of the sick veterans have Mycoplasma incognitus fermentans with the HIV envelope gene attached. And he originally seemed to think that this could have been a biological attack. But my accumulated evidence as a researcher is now indicating that this may in fact have been an experiment wherein many troops were vaccinated with an experimental AIDS vaccine.
They found in the blood an excess of a product called squalene, which is apparently an adjuvant and an addition to a vaccine. Normally, a product called alum is added as an adjuvant, but in this instance, in the blood, they are finding an excess of this agent called squalene, along with the HIV envelope. Now, I'm not suggesting that our troops now have AIDS, by no means. However, when we're talking about an HIV envelope, we are in fact talking about a portion of the AIDS virus itself, but that portion which facilitates the entry into the body cells themselves of whatever accompanies it.
I woke up one morning and these knuckles in my hand were like golf balls, and I just kind of blew it off. Maybe I injured something or an old injury, and about 2 days later I woke up and my feet were swollen like elephantitis. Purple, I couldn't walk on them, they were very tingly and sensitive, so I would have to crawl. And at this point in my life we had a newborn son who I was trying to take care of also, and so I would have to crawl to his crib and lift myself up and get him out of the crib and crawl to the, I mean, it was amazing. My parents helped out quite a bit.
My son cannot balance a checkbook without help. He can't remember how to get home at times. We are talking about a young man that was a student of the year for his county, National Honor Society, captain of the rifle team, president of Vicar, the vocational education programs, that can't remember. You send him to the store for half a dozen things and he can't remember. Comes home with a Coke and he forgot what he was supposed to get. This is not normal.
It's amazing how many soldiers are dying from brain tumors and cancers that they don't even consider those a problem, or the car accidents. And it's really strange. One of my other friends died in a car accident, and because we don't have that memory recall like we used to, you could be sitting at a stop sign and knowing that it's red, but you know the other cars, there's nothing coming, the other cars went, so all of a sudden you go, and you have to really teach yourself to pay attention again. Watch how you drive, put the car in reverse, look where you're, you know, it's like a whole training that you have to reteach yourself how to do simple things.
I was just always healthy. I had 7.5 years of karate before the service. I boxed for 2 years. I was just always on the go. And when these things started happening to me, I was just, there was no way. You know, maybe old age or whatever, but I was thinking at the time I was only 31 years old. And I didn't know what to do. I just absolutely did not know what to do. And somebody told me, you're a veteran, go to a VA hospital. And I tried civilian doctors first, and they did not have a clue. I went to a hand specialist, a bone specialist, they didn't have a clue. And I went to the VA hospital, and that's when they refused to see me because there was no record of anything, of me even existing in the service.
An important dimension of the problem is that families of Gulf War veterans have not been spared from suffering. A survey of 1,000 servicemen and women conducted by the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs revealed that an assortment of illnesses associated with Gulf War syndrome are in fact contagious.
It's difficult for the families. Quite often they'll end up divorced. So you have to understand people's personalities change as a result of chemical biological warfare. That's something that people don't understand unless they've been through it. I'll give you an example. My husband's case, he developed pancreatic cancer after the war. Or actually, I think it was probably during the war, but there's no conclusive evidence to support that. His personality changed about a year before he died. He was always extremely active, never sat still, always mowing the lawn or cleaning the garage or something, always running. He went into a serious depression. He would never lose his temper. He would lose, after he came back from the war, slowly he began to lose his temper over ridiculous things. Not knowing, looking back now and not knowing at the time that he was sick, I thought he was crazy. What else are you to think? And people don't understand that, and quite oftentimes couples will end up divorced before the spouse realizes that this person is sick.
To me, he's like going downhill every day. I mean, he's not getting any better. And as far as myself, I was on the verge of being a diabetic when he left, but since he came home, my sugar has been totally out of control. I've lost 100 pounds in the past year, and the doctors can't understand why my sugar still hasn't gone down after losing 100 pounds. I have the achy joints. Now I have fibromyalgia. Also, I have the problem with the burning semen. So our sex life, needless to say, is not that great anymore due to that fact. Because it really gets severe, and my gynecologist says he's never seen anything like it.
What type of exposure is going to transport the disease from one person to another? And that's scary. And I don't know if I should use the term disease because I have no idea whether it's a disease or whether it's a couple dozen, and that's the one thing that scares me, is giving it to somebody I love.
My worst fears, there's two. One is that I'm going to die a very HIV-like death, because so far, so much of this has mimicked HIV, and I'm going to end up like a skeleton in the bed. And my second fear is that I'm going to pass this along to the people that I love. And that's what really upsets me.
Germs from the Gulf are good travelers, according to members of the medical community who have expressed concern regarding the possibility of infectious microorganisms becoming fastened to equipment and other materials. They cite instances of Navy personnel on aircraft carriers who never set foot on land, but who mysteriously acquired the syndrome subsequent to active duty in the Gulf region. When aircraft returning from overseas service were unloaded in domestic Air Force bases at the conclusion of the war, the contaminated equipment aboard the returning planes may have facilitated the disease's dissemination into the general population. It's estimated that clothing brought back by soldiers may contain infectious microorganisms that can survive for up to 7 years.
These soldiers, myself included, brought this stuff home to their spouses and their children, and they cross-contaminated them. The people that were in charge knew that this was happening. Their documentation proves that they had full and complete knowledge that this was going to happen. They still brought troops through to Tallil Airfield and Jalaba Airfield, which was in the contamination zone downwind from Kamassia and all the other destroyed facilities. They marched them through there a few days after Kamassia was destroyed and put them on C-130s and took them down into Saudi Arabia and immediately retrograded them from there back home. They went into a contaminated area and they took it home to their kids and their wives and their husbands. That is absolutely unconscionable, and something needs to be changed about that. This was policy-driven, not fact-driven. And the people at the highest level of command knew about that, including General Schwarzkopf. General Franks, who was in charge of 7th Corps, knew it too. The documentation proves that as well.
And it has to have been fairly well known before we went over. When I remember very vividly the night I left, they went through all of our bags, making sure that we didn't bring any sand home as souvenirs. They told us we'd go to the brig. They told us we'd be up for captain's mast if they found sand in our things. And if you gave it up now, you were okay. And a lot of us did. A lot of us just wanted to bring a little sand back as a souvenir. Couldn't do it. After I got back, I went to the blood bank to donate blood. I was told, oh, you're a Gulf War vet, you can't donate blood. I said, why? Well, we just got word that you can't. So since 1991, I've been unable to donate blood, and I don't know why. But there's nothing wrong with me. I find that a little disturbing.
It's been estimated that 30% of Gulf War veterans' babies are born with deformities. This is 10 times higher than the number of birth defects one would expect to find in the general population.
Well, now my son was born with a birth defect as a result of the war. Now he's had cleft lip and palate. He's had 3 surgeries. He needs at least 2 more. VA is not covering any of that. They've denied all of our benefits. He has speech therapy. He has tubes in his ears. He's had constant ear infections, so now he has hearing loss in one side. He has no father. He died when he was 2. He was not pleased that we were going to have another baby. Not that he didn't want to have another baby, but he was afraid. He was afraid of what he was exposed to, the shots he was given. I didn't share that concern at that time. I was just thrilled. And then my son was born, and my husband carried the guilt of that child until he died. He carried that guilt with him. He always blamed himself for it. I never placed blame. I figured God gave us a child, gave us a handicapped child because we could handle a handicapped child. That was it.
The study that was brought out about last year, that there are no significant abnormalities in babies born to Gulf War vets, the research was so significantly flawed, just from any researcher's point of view. They discounted all the births in civilian hospitals, and they discounted births in other states, that I am really dreadfully afraid to try and conceive and carry a child. I am just looking at my hair and my memory and my skin and things like that. I can't imagine what's happening on the inside of me and what may have happened to that very fragile genetic material that's in the ovaries. It scares me to death to try and think about carrying a child.
We were never warned not to have children, or to wait, or to take precautions due to chemical or exposures or anything of that nature.
My whole family life has changed. I don't have that intimacy anymore with my husband because I have no feelings. I don't play ball anymore with my son because by the time I throw the ball, my muscles and my arms hurt so bad, they get so heavy. So when they say the soldiers are in this for the money, it's not a matter of money. We just want to get well. We want someone to take an interest in us and try and treat us.
Our goal is not to find out what made us sick. Our goal is not to find out who made us sick, and our goal is definitely not to find out who we're going to put in prison for it. That will come. That will come with the help of the media, the help of Congress, the help of the Attorney General's office. That will come. What our goal is our health. We want our health back. We want our family members' health back.
I've had doctors that are sympathetic and want to know more, that have had to be signed out by their higher up, their chief of staff, before they could say anything. They were monitored in what they said. Even had one physician that her husband served over there with us that closed the door after her chief of staff left and said, I want to see everything you have. I want to know what's going on. And when I took it in and left it with her, I took her a stag this high, and I left it with her, the next thing I knew is I had a first sergeant up there going through the CCEP program, and he laughed the next time I saw him. He said, well, I have a feeling you dropped off a package of information to somebody, because we saw a female doctor flying down the hall after the doctor in charge, being very upset and mad that there was a lot of information out there that wasn't being shared with the physicians.
I had one doctor tell me, he was an Air Force doctor, matter of fact, captain, who did not physically examine me, but spent 10 minutes with me in his examining room asking me questions. And after discussing the gynecological problems, he looked me point blank in the face and asked me why I even wanted to get pregnant, that I was never going to get pregnant, so why even try? I left there in tears that day.
Some would tell you it's all in your head. Others would just, their reaction to it was in such a way that you knew they didn't believe, that there could have been any connection, that you were either making it up or that you were malingering or that it was all psychosomatic.
If I were a soldier, I'd be outraged when they go to a VA facility, they explain the symptoms they have. They're real, they're not imagined, and the VA is so unresponsive. It is really hard to explain that, but there are probably some who have post-traumatic stress disorder. There are probably some within the range of the 700,000 soldiers who were sent, but probably a very minor factor in this. Chemical exposure, the vaccines, a whole host of other things are right at the center of this.
I don't believe that this is any kind of classic PTSD. In fact, my observations are that the rates for PTSD were very low during the war, and that the actual figures although we hear so much about stress being a contributing factor, are very low. I think that I'm observing depression, frustration, anger, which I think are normal responses to people having illnesses that they don't understand.
My son has fought for the last 7 years to get medical care. We have done everything that the VA has asked us to do. We have filed the paperwork. We have done whatever requests that they have made from us as far as going to testing and things like that. He still has not received medical care. When the recruiter sat on my couch to recruit my son as a member of the United States All-Volunteer Army, he told us that if our son got hurt, wounded, sick, or injured in the service of his country, that they would be taken care of. What we want, what I want as a parent of a veteran, is for the United States government, as per the Department of Defense, to honor the contract that they made with us. Not a handout, not a pension, but to take care of the sick soldier.
We did our mission. Now, take care of us, or else enable us to take care of ourselves.
The British veterans are in an even more difficult position than American veterans in some ways because there's no Freedom of Information Act. And currently, British veterans are being told that they cannot have their own vaccination records. So I ask, how can they then possibly expect to receive proper medical attention when vaccination records are always necessary for a doctor to understand exactly what could be causing an illness?
The dilemma of the soldier on active duty is that by coming forward, he risks losing his job, his health care, his family's health care, and his retirement. So you have this great downward pressure for them not to come forward. The problem with that is that we may have soldiers who are not 100% still on active duty concealing their illnesses as a result of their service in the Gulf. Not because they want to conceal it, but because the military won't recognize these illnesses as a result of their service, and that their only option is to be forced out for not being capable of performing their duties.
I also think that some people who are ill are not admitting that they're ill. There's huge denial. This is my opinion. I find huge denial in many veterans, and I put it to object relations theory, love of country, and the government as bad parent object.
How extensive is the cover-up? The Regal report essentially accuses the Department of Defense of lying to the American public and condemns it for abandoning the servicemen who are willing to die for their country. Senator Regal referred to the heartlessness and irresponsibility of the military bureaucracy, concluding there is no more serious crime than a cover-up of facts that could facilitate the diagnosis and treatment of sick U.S. veterans.
We need much more candor from the DOD and the VA and the CIA, a lot more candor. And it's gotten to the point now where this may sound a bit harsh, but some heads need to roll. Because I really believe that all three, to various degrees, have participated in a cover-up that has resulted in the bad health of many of our heroes who served there, and has resulted in the death of some of them. And the longer it takes for us to resolve this issue and unravel this puzzle and solve this mystery, the more illnesses we're going to see and the more deaths we're going to see. So we're at that point now where it's almost criminal, the lack of cooperation we've received from various government agencies.
Well, we clearly have a state of denial underway on the part of most of the executive branch. The Pentagon doesn't want to deal with this for a lot of political reasons and military reasons. If they have to admit that they exposed 250,000 of their own troops as a result of bombing these facilities, Desert Storm is no longer this quick, clean win that Colin Powell has tried to make it out to be. Secondly, if they have to admit that the Iraqis actually used these weapons even once, we didn't respond to that. It means deterrence failed. And is that going to embolden a Kim Jong-il in Korea or a Muammar Gaddafi in Libya or some of these other third world lunatics, essentially, that have got these kinds of weapons programs? Yes, it would, no doubt about it. And then there's another aspect of this that I think is really, really very, very corrosive, and that is the money issue. I don't think the federal government wants to spend the money to help these people. I think that's what a lot of this really boils down to. If you have to actually pay out a lot of benefits to these veterans in a very tight budget environment, you're going to increase the deficit. I don't think there's any way of getting around it. Clinton doesn't want to do that. The Republicans don't want to deal with that. And I think that's why Gulf War veterans are continuing to fall through the cracks in that respect. It's a big money issue, and they don't want to deal with it.
I think it would be much easier if they would just come out and tell us the truth. You know, neither John nor I are asking for monetary assistance. We don't receive any. We don't receive disability, neither he nor I. All we want is to get John better, to get me better. If they would just tell the truth, so we know how to treat it, so we know how to diagnose it. Cover up, yes. I do think there's a cover-up.
Although the Gulf War syndrome sickness issue has been raised time and time again and has in fact elicited a response from the military, come back in, we will test you again. Nevertheless, there are no answers forthcoming, and in fact no documentation for the most part. So we're faced with a situation of sick people, now also wives and children, as well as the members of the military themselves, who go in and have blood drawn, wait upon test results coming back, so with the hope that they can finally know what's wrong with them, only to be told that nothing was found. And when they ask for a hard copy of the lab results, it's not forthcoming. These blood tests are taken over and over and over again. What are they doing with all this blood? Where is it? Where are these hard copy test results? Another type of testing that appears to be going on is spinal taps. As one example, a vet who's very ill, with whom I'm familiar and speak quite frequently, has now had 28 spinal taps done and was scheduled for a 29th. What is this about? Why are spinal taps being taken? It obviously is not helping him regarding any sort of evaluation as to what's wrong with him. He continues to worsen. What sort of readings might they be taking from these spinal taps?
Well, as far as the veterans are concerned, I think that a lot of the private medical research that's currently underway is going to help give us the solution to a lot of these medical problems that the veterans are suffering from. As far as holding officials accountable, in large measure, that's going to be up to the Congress of the United States. The big question that I have right now is, are they going to step up to the plate, issue subpoenas, hold meaningful hearings that will really do something to hold people accountable? Because there have been some criminal acts committed in all of this. Trying to reclassify information is a criminal act. Trying to intimidate veterans into silence, which the Pentagon has done, is a criminal act. That needs to be prosecuted, and the people responsible for it need to go to jail.
I helped stamp and sign close to 1,000 medical records documenting those anthrax vaccines. In many cases, they're not there now. People have no proof that they ever got those vaccines. And you ask me if there's a cover-up? Nah, no cover-up. Right. It just doesn't make sense to me. Those kinds of things that I saw there as a healthcare provider, I mean, if I tampered with a medical record in the state of Delaware, I could lose my license, go to jail, be civilly sued. I mean, I could be hung out to dry. But somebody else tampers with medical records and it's okay? That just doesn't make sense to me. I personally did those things. I made those databases. I helped do those medical records. And where are they? I don't know. those are the kinds of things that I saw over there. I know what I did. My memory's not that bad.
Unfortunately, I do feel there has been a cover-up in the Gulf War issue. I think particularly there needs to be a full investigation into the NIH Manhattan Project and into vaccinations. I think there needs to be more testing and more research on biological and chemical use too.
The U.S. was a participant in the Geneva Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, and we, as well as Iraq, signed the resultant agreement that prohibited both experimentation with and the sale of biologicals or weapons of mass destruction. Now, obviously, our government has a considerable interest in keeping the U.S. breach of this agreement covered up. Plus, there's the inconvenient fact of our history of cooperation with Saddam Hussein, a tyrant who was denounced by the global community and likened Adolf Hitler. Embarrassment about revealing our past dealings with our current enemy has hampered our government's readiness to deal fairly with veterans.
Once we had begun that investigation, the Pentagon immediately reacted negatively to what we had to say, and although the evidence seemed to be overwhelming that this did occur, the Pentagon began to take an intransigent position. We then started requesting records, logs, documents, and evidence of exports of materials that might indicate U.S. involvement in arming Iraq and that these exposures may have occurred. Over the next 6 months or so, the number of people on the Gulf War Registry from both the veterans community and from the active duty community multiplied almost fivefold. We also started getting responses from the Pentagon indicating that there were no records that indicated that there were any detections of or any exposures to chemical agents. And we knew at that point that they were lying because we had documents in hand that we had gotten from many sources that indicated that these did in fact occur. In fact, there were public press accounts that detections had occurred, that both the Czechs and the French had detected chemical agents, and that many of these agents were being attributed to the fallout from the bombing of the Iraqi chemical weapons research, production, and storage infrastructure. During the committee investigation, we held hearings during which Pentagon officials again deliberately misled Congress under oath about the nature of the exposures that the veterans sustained. And in May of 1994, we actually received a letter from the Secretary of Defense, Health and Human Services, and Department of Veterans Affairs indicating that there was no information, classified or unclassified, indicating any detections of or exposures to chemical agents. We now know that that information was all false and that these people intentionally misled Congress on this issue.
In front of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, General Schwarzkopf publicly stated that he had no knowledge at that time or to the present when he was interviewed by the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee of PFC David Allen Fisher's contamination or injury. This document from the 7th Corps After Action Reports states specifically that yes, he did know, and his feeling was, it's only one person, so don't make anything big out of it. There should have been preparations ahead of time, and definitely there should have been a different reaction other than, oh well.
I accept nothing at face value from the DOD, the VA, the CIA, and even the Department of Energy, which really hasn't come before our committee, because they have done nothing to make me feel that when they testify before us, what they say is credible. So I always assume that we're only learning part of the story.
They're rewriting history. That's the bottom line. They're taking what actually occurred and they're making a policy decision. Their policy is, we don't admit it, it doesn't exist. Until DOD admits that it did actually happen, they don't have to do anything about it. The problem that they've got right now is if they admit that those chemical alarms were set off by fallout that made it all the way down to Saudi Arabia, they will have to admit that they messed up on the bombing raids, that their planning totally flopped, that they didn't take into account certain crucial elements that were so basic to the entire thing that it was a no-brainer. They should have known this. And their documentation proves that they actually did know this, they just disregarded it.
The fact is, they underestimated the nature of the threat during the war, They were ill-prepared to deal with the issue of low-level chemical agent fallout. They were ill-prepared to deal with the preventive medicine measures necessary to prevent our soldiers from getting sick as a result of their exposures, and they were ill-prepared to conduct the investigations afterwards. The military is not a good arbiter of the health of American citizens. We have health agencies, we have research institutes, we have foundations and universities that do this kind of research on a daily basis. Our veterans get the leftovers, people with the bureaucratic agendas, people who are trying to defend their past positions, rather than the best available medical science that every other disease in this country gets.
I wouldn't even be so upset if they would just come forward and say, well, yeah, we gave you all this stuff, we really thought we were trying to help, and it didn't, and we're really sorry. So now what can we do? Let's try and treat it. Just tell me that you screwed up. Just tell me that you messed it up somehow. People just don't lie to me. I wasn't a child when you sent me over there. I'm certainly not a child now, and something has happened to me, something that has changed me irrevocably, and nobody will meet my eye on it from this government, and that really upsets me.
How much longer can the White House, the Pentagon, the Veterans Administration, the CIA, and other agencies responsible for helping these veterans be able to deny the truth?
Here's where you can make a difference. Not on my watch are we going to let something like this happen. Clearly something happened. And to see, in essence, the stonewalling by both the CIA as well as the Pentagon, I give a lot of credit, and I talk to my colleagues, Chris Shays and other Republicans and Democrats helping to lead the charge. We've at least put a foot in the door. And we've gotten them now to admit some things that I don't think a couple years ago they denied. But we have to continue. We can't let them just sweep this thing under the rug.
I feel that the Pentagon should be held responsible, and they should have some criminal war suits against the Pentagon, President Bush, all the generals that exposed the soldiers to these chemicals and toxins without warning us, using a weapon on us without knowing the full effects of it. I really feel that the Pentagon should be held socially responsible to take care of these soldiers and the people that this weapon has affected. And the Iraqi people are suffering from the radioactive material that's still in their land, and someone needs to be socially accountable for cleanup in that country. We've cleaned up foreign countries, we've cleaned up Vietnam, we cleaned up Japan, we helped clean up Germany. Why can't we help clean up Iraq? Because these people are still suffering from radioactive material that has a life of 4.1 billion years, a half-life, and someone needs to be socially accountable for what happened over there, the weapons that we used.
I think that there are certain members of the Presidential Advisory Committee who truly do understand that there is a real problem here, not just a medical problem, but a legal and a political problem. And they have tried to have as much of an impact on the process as they can. But this panel has been controlled by a group of individuals who, quite frankly, have sought to try to play down the problem and make the problem go away. It's not going to go away. And in the end, I think that history is going to judge that this panel was just another one of those Washington blue ribbon style panels that administrations use to try to make unpleasant problems go away. But this one will not go away.
The inadequacy of this committee is giving some incentive to Congress to do more than just talk about this issue. That's all we've heard from Congress thus far. Minor pieces of legislation, a presumption of exposure to a disease that the VA claims doesn't exist, and lip service saying that we're doing everything we can while at the same time doing absolutely nothing. What we need now is for the research, for the diagnostics, and for the cause and effect relationship investigations to be taken away from those who have lied to Congress repeatedly about this issue.
As one of the loudest lobbying voices in Washington, D.C. right now, it might be damaging to some of their careers because there's just too many of us. 700,000 of us went overseas, 225,000 are claiming illnesses. All of those veterans have family members. And if Congress can consider one veteran 3 votes. We can consider one veteran 3 family members that's going to cry and whine and complain and fight and kick and scratch, testify, do interviews, whatever it takes to get this story out there and keep it in the mainstream until we get justification.
The longer that it takes to get the government to properly address this issue, warts and all, the more veterans will die, the more who will become chronically ill. I, for one, would not like to see any grandchild of mine be sent off to some future war to be subjected to something like this again, where upon returning, their own government doesn't do what it should do.
I sent those soldiers to the Persian Gulf. I voted to confront Saddam Hussein, get him out of Kuwait, not allow him to control nearly 50% of the world's oil and amass an incredible military machine. I felt very right then when I voted to send our troops there, and I feel right now. But I have this aching heart that the soldiers I sent were not treated properly in terms of their potential exposure, and clearly not treated properly once they came home. And I have a hard time living with that.
We have gotten the VA now to, I think, 9 laws from when we started this have been passed to better the veterans' lives. And a landmark decision was when the VA decided to give compensation and pension to undiagnosed illnesses. That had never, ever happened in the history of the VA before, and that was very rewarding for us. It's just been a long road. It's a never-ending road so far. A lot of us cannot see the end of this road, and we don't know if we will see the end of this road. And for many, the end of the road came when they died.
I served proudly. I felt I was serving my country. I felt I was defending my country. I would fight for the American people. I would fight for the human rights. I would fight for freedom, but knowing what the Department of Defense has done to us, I wouldn't fight for the Department of Defense. I feel that the Department of Defense, it's kind of like uses people as guinea pigs in experimentations, and then they don't want to accept any of the responsibility to take care of us.
As I say, this is a transition that is very hard, and I hope I do it with grace.
It's not possible in a short period of time to tell an entire story, not one that spans nearly a decade and hundreds of thousands of lives. But it's a beginning. For all the Gulf War veterans and their families and those who've tried to help them, hopefully this program will be one step further in trying to open up the door of secrecy that has occurred around this entire phenomena. I'm Gary Null. Thank you very much for watching.